Okay. Hi, everyone. For those of you who are already with us, we're going to be waiting another minute so people have a chance to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, we're going to get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Abrahams. I'm a program officer here at the AVI CHAI Foundation. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon, taking some time to learn together with us. With me today is Professor Leslie Siskin from NYU. She's worked with us over the last few years to study our initiatives. And we're going together to speak about some of the work that we've done and the lessons that we've learned. So we're going to begin. Deborah, you can put up the slides when you're ready. Today we're going to be focusing on the two latest reports that AVI CHAI has published. They are, you can find them online on our website in our Knowledge Center. There are these follow some reports about the field at large, but today we're focused on two case studies in particular. One about Zafon, another about a school called Ma'arav. We've decided to present the case studies anonymously, not identifying the schools that we're studying. We think that we gain more when schools know that they have some anonymity in the process. This is common in research. Okay. So the slides are not up yet, but I'm going to keep going, and hopefully Deborah is working on getting the slides up. So we wanted first to provide a little bit of context for the case studies that we're going to talk about today, in the larger context of AVI CHAI's work in this area. We started in this area about maybe 4 years ago, and at the time, we wanted to think about how we might shift the day school field into the area of blended and online learning, and we developed kind of a three-prong strategy to do so, which hopefully we will see in a minute pictorially, but I'll keep talking meanwhile. One area that we wanted to work with was obviously with the largest group of schools, day schools that are out there today, established schools, and getting them to experiment with blended and online learning, and For the most part, this has been done through projects with the Digital J Learning Network and Torah Umisora. In addition, we have a program where those schools are kind of moving more slowly, experimenting. They received small grants to do work. And then we have a separate program called Mohl Day Schools, where there's a smaller group of schools doing deeper work over a faster period. Here come the slides. Great. Okay, so we can move through them kind of quickly. You can move from that one, Deborah, to the next one or two. Those are the covers of the reports, which we said you could find in our Knowledge Center, right? And here's the next slide with the picture of our strategy. In the middle, you can see thinking about a move at about 150 established schools by the time AVI CHAI closes in end of 2019. That's what we are hoping to accomplish. At the same time, we wanted to fund the opening of about 10 new schools. I would say that's becoming more unlikely that we will reach the number 10. We've supported about 5 up until now. I'm not sure that there are more on the horizon as of yet. With the notion that new schools have the freedom to develop models from scratch. We're going to talk obviously about that today. And the third area was developing blended and online learning in the area of Judaics, both in terms of supporting our already funded projects with ITAUAM and NETA, but also developing online Judaic studies courses through the Lookstein Center, as well as the new project with the Online Judaic Studies Consortium based at the virtual high school. So that was kind of a big picture of what we wanted to do. I'm going to stop for 1 second now that the slides are up and remind people that you can submit questions in the box below the video that you're seeing on your page. There's a box below. You can submit either questions or comments, or if you're having any technical difficulties, let us know in that box. Someone is monitoring them as they come in. Now back to the slides. We hope that this work in blended and online learning that we're really doing in parallel with the rest of the education world, private schools and public schools alike, we are at peace with the development in the rest of the education world. We hope that this work would allow both for what you see on the bottom, both better quality Jewish day schools as well as lower tuition. And we'll see this more in the next slide, where we kind of laid out why we hope to do this. I think we believed that data-driven, personalized instruction would lead to better results for our students, and we at least wanted schools to be seeing if this was the case, right? I think one of the things in the beauty of being in a foundation, and especially a foundation that is spending down, is the ability to take some risks, and I think we saw this area as an opportunity for research and development to really learn what blended and online learning could bring to the Jewish day school field. So again, in the next slide, you'll see that it says both an educational goal as well as a financial goal, which maybe we'll get back to at the end. I think we hope that both of those would become realized through blended and online learning. So I would say that we also knew that as we were doing this work, a key component of the work would be sharing the lessons that with the field. That's both with practitioners as well as funders and with lay leaders. And so education and advocacy became a big part of the work that we're doing. We were lucky to find a wonderful partner in that work with Professor Leslie Siskin, who's been looking at some of our initiatives over the last 3 years, both in terms of individual schools, which we're going to talk about today, but also kind of the work at large. And so I'm going to really turn over the rest of the webinar to her so that she can go, teach us about what she's learned. And I'll be commenting as we go, and then at the end we hope to answer some questions and and I'll come back at that time too. So Leslie, please. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background first, about the field, what's happening in the field, and about how our study is unfolding. And then a little bit about what distinguishes the two cases that are now available for you to read, because we learned some distinctive lessons from each of those sites, and then broaden out a little bit to what we're learning more generally from the study of other schools as well as those schools. So if I can go to the next slide. I want to start out by just giving us a definition of what blended learning is. Although there's a lot of uncertainty about how people define it and how people implement it, the most popular definition right now is one that comes out of the Christensen Institute, that blended learning is a formal education program in which a student learns, at least in part through online learning, with some element of student control over time, place, path, and/or pace, at least in part in a supervised brick and mortar location, like a school, which distinguishes this from virtual schooling, at-home schooling. And the modalities along each student's learning path within a course or subject are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. And that last component was added more recently in the Christensen definition, and it's part of what distinguishes blended learning from technology-enhanced learning. So we're using that definition. We're paying a little bit more attention to two other features that are characteristic of blended learning. One is the increasing attention and effort toward personalized learning, and many in the field are now using the term personalized learning instead of blended learning, like the Gates Foundation. And also attention to the idea of diagnostic assessment and data use for the purpose of informed and intentional differentiation of those learning paths that students are on. Next slide. So I want to say something first about the field. As Rachel said a minute ago, there's a lot of activity happening in the field, in district schools, in charter schools, in religious schools, in private schools. A lot of activity and new products coming out from developers and advocates, a lot of policy shift that's changing, and a lot of the presence of some effort at blended or online learning in schools and in students' work across the country. And strikingly, I think for us, maybe a little surprisingly, day schools, at least some day schools, are at the leading edge of this wave. So it's important to learn what's going on in these schools. To do that, we've been doing a study, next slide, over the past 3 years, looking a little bit at what's happening in more than 30 day schools, including elementary and high schools, urban and suburban, small and mid-sized schools, some of them doing what Rachel talks about as revolutionary work, trying to design new models and start new schools, and some doing evolutionary work, where they're trying to take an established school and begin to incorporate online and blended learning into the practices they already have. So we've done 3 years of field work. We've sat in and done observations in classrooms across the country. We've interviewed teachers and administrators in a variety of schools. We've done phone interviews where we couldn't go and actually visit the site. And we've looked at documents like financial reports and surveys. And we have also actually, interestingly, done some of the online learning that students are doing by trying out some of their programs. Next slide. Across the schools, I think one of the things that was most striking is just how extraordinarily welcoming the staff were in the schools and how open and willing they were to share their work, whether it was working or not. Some schools and some teachers were initially skeptical, worried that this might be just another fad or that it might be too hard to change practice. And it is hard. and it often takes longer than schools or faculty thought it would to learn how to do this. But one of the most striking findings across our study is that no one who started experimenting with blended learning has chosen to stop, although some schools didn't survive. But it is a risky enterprise. Next slide. For the new schools who were starting up, who had to find space, who had to develop a program, had to hire staff, had to recruit students, had to find startup funding, and then often had to find more money to help operations or professional development. And it was risky for established schools who had to try to bring in new practices and tools and to explain those to the families and sometimes to the students who weren't sure, why are we doing something so different from what we always have done and has worked rather well in the past? And there's a risk, too, for teachers who need additional support when they might not be confident about what this change involves or about their own capacity to deliver it. And some of these risks we saw play out when things didn't work according to plan, when the Wi-Fi service went down or was inadequate when 6 classes wanted to show video at the same time, when a program that a school chose didn't work out, when students resisted and said this is not the way we should learn, or teachers were reluctant. And we did see that 2 of the new schools had a hard time not with the technology or with the educational program, but with starting and maintaining a school and with recruiting enough students to keep going. So if it's risky, why do people do it? And why do people keep going? So our basic answer, next slide, is that for most of the schools, people were looking at blended learning not because it was a cool and exciting thing to do, but because it was practical to help them solve problems that they were facing in their schools. So in one case, an administrator said, we have a student in a course with a teacher. It's just a bad match. Can you find something else for me? Can we go back a slide? But the school had a hard time finding another teacher. In another, they talked about trying to reach diverse groups of students within the class and having increasingly heterogeneous classes, even in small schools. They needed more variety of offerings for a continually diversifying student body. They needed to find new and creative ways to fit things into an overloaded schedule. And they wanted to find ways to use resources that they couldn't provide in the classroom, like virtual labs. Okay, next slide. As they were trying to solve these problems, what we saw, and what the field generally agrees with, is the schools were moving along a continuum from the traditional face-to-face teacher-delivered instruction to technology-enhanced, where online resources or courses might be available, to truly blended, and I'll talk more about that later. None of the schools, however, wanted to go to fully online programs or to become a fully online course. So most of the schools are either somewhere between technology enhanced or moving toward truly blended. But this is definitely a process, and in every school that we're in, it's a work in progress. Because they're trying to solve practical problems, what we saw across the schools is people saying we're taking a lot of steps, but they're not necessarily, next slide, taking the same steps. This is not like rolling out one design or model that all schools are implementing. What steps they started with and what their patterns of blended learning look like is very different in different schools. Next slide.
Yeah, I just want to interrupt for a second. We have gotten some messages that people are having trouble seeing the slides. If that's true, we'll be able to make slides available if for some reason it's not recording with slides. So just listen, and you'll be able to look at slides afterwards if you're having trouble.
Okay. I am seeing them on my screen, but they're very dark. So it's a little hard to see. But this next slide is a quote from a teacher in one of the schools who says, "I don't think there is one answer when I asked what blended learning is. You have to consider the teacher, the content, the student needs, and the school needs. We are talking to ourselves about being thoughtfully blended, and we're experimenting. And they're experimenting in different ways in different schools, in different subjects, and sometimes even day to day. They're trying things, and if they don't work, they're trying something different." The next slide says, "It depends," which is something researchers often say and schools often find very frustrating. But we can say that it depends. What blended learning looks like depends on what function it is intended to serve, what problems we're trying to solve, what form it will take, and how and where it fits into existing practice and values. And because it takes different form in different schools, as we looked across them, with the AVI CHAI staff, we selected 4 schools to do a kind of deeper dive, to look more closely, because they were doing different things. One was doing a station rotation model, one was doing gradual change, and those are the 2 we're going to talk about as the cases today. Another was focusing on personalized pathways, and the 4th was focusing on project-based learning and using technology as a tool to projects. So, next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about Zafon, which is a case. And I want to stress one thing just briefly. A case means a purposeful look from a set of questions that a researcher brings to the school. This is not the full story of that school. It's a much more complex, active, and dynamic site than anybody could possibly cover in 20 pages. So a case study is a partial story, but it's still something that we can learn from. And because it's a partial story and not an accurate reflection of a real school, that's one of the reasons why we observe the norms of confidentiality, and we give this school a fictitious name. So what is the case of Zafon? Zafon is a new school that started up. So it's a case of developing a vision, designing a plan, and then working to implement and activate that plan in real life, in real time, with real people. It's a mix of new and familiar forms, and it's also, in this case, an attempt to create a proof point that one could have a high-quality day school at a substantially lower cost. The other distinguishing feature about Zafon is the serious investment they made in data use for guiding instruction. So what do we learn from Zafon? I'm not going to talk a lot about the specifics of what's in the case. I'm hoping that you will read that, or you may have read that already. But let me just highlight a couple of the lessons that I think we learned from them. The first is that a year of planning and a carefully planned design can be very helpful. Although once they got into implementation, into real time and real people, they found that they needed to do some tweaking. Most of what that school implemented was what the design had intended for them to do. A second lesson we learned was that an active and committed board can help to bring in additional resources, to get publicity for the school, to recruit students, and to give a kind of support and confidence to the school. Lesson 3 is that teacher candidates are not hard to find, but selecting and supporting them is key and is not always easy. Fourth is this is a school that began with a station rotation model. It's an elementary school, and for many elementary schools across the country, all kinds of different schools, stations are a relatively familiar form. It's confidence encouraging for families to see something that they recognize. and for teachers to be able to use their experience with moving students from sandboxes to reading circles to develop ways of moving them to computer instruction for one of their rotations. The fifth thing that we learned is that technology does matter. One of the things that you often hear about blended learning is that it's not about the technology. It's really about teaching with new tools. But it turns out that the technology itself does matter in important ways. It matters if you have, at the simplest level, if you have to find a mouse that a 4-year-old's hand can fit and control. It matters when you decide whether students who are working at the computer will be working individually with headsets so that they can turn to each other and talk, or whether you create barricades between students that puts them in their own little cubicles. So one of the things that we learned from Zafon is being very thoughtful initially about how these technology structures and infrastructures were going to work was really helpful, but also looking and reflecting on how does it work in practice. It turns out that moving 20 students from rotation station to station actually takes longer in the beginning than many teachers had allowed for, and that you have to develop routines to make these new habits a part of the way everyday instruction works. We also learn that what programs you bring into the school matters, both in what they provide and in how much they cost, and in how they or whether they actually help to work with instruction. And Zafon again came up with an elaborate template in its planning year, and then worked harder when they got into real-life situations to try to find programs that would work for instruction in reading, in math, in Hebrew, and in Judaic studies that would fit within the school that they're trying to build. One of the dangers of being at the leading edge of the wave is sometimes the products aren't as good as you hope they would be. And the last lesson I think we learned from Zafon is that data use can actually be useful. It's hard for teachers to figure out when data are coming and swarming at them what things they need to pay attention to and what to do with the data to make learning different. But teachers across the board at Zafon talked about how they could do things that they never could do otherwise, that they could do things quickly, that they would have had to wait for a specialist to come in and do diagnostics to figure out why students were having trouble with certain skills, and that they could actually change stations, change timing, or change groupings based on the instruction that they got. So those are, I think, the main lessons we got from Zafon. That's case one. Case two is a very different kind of case. Ma'arav is an established school, supporting and seeing through a gradual change in its existing facility and faculty. They're trying to figure out how to build on strengths, and they are a strong school to start with. How to expand their capacity without increasing costs. How to build learning communities inside their schools. It's less about having a grand plan in the beginning and more about working with what you have and working toward what you need. But working with what you have takes knowing what you have and knowing who you have. So one of the things that we learned from Ma'arav is that the school discovered early adopters in some sometimes surprising places. They were not necessarily new teachers or young teachers or general studies teachers. They were teachers who were trying to improve their practice or deal with a problem and thought technology would be helpful. We also learned something from Ma'arav about connecting teachers. connecting the early adopters to people who are a little more reluctant, a little more skeptical, and want to see if something can really work in their school before they're willing to try it. Connecting teachers and rearranging schedules so that they can support and push each other forward. As they tried to do that, we learned something about the challenge of time. How do you find time for teachers to work together in a full schedule with a dual curriculum? And we learned something about the challenge of trying to bring new technology into an old building where the wiring was not set up for anything like what even a small group of early adopters wanted to do. So the last thing I think, and the most important thing that we learned from Marav, was something about patience. That if you're trying to encourage teachers, but not punish teachers or mandate change, it takes a little bit of time to get it started, to get it growing, but then it builds up speed and it builds up momentum. And blended learning is moving through this school in ways that some of the early adopters probably never anticipated. So those are the two kind of distinctive cases that I hope you'll read that have very different kinds of lessons to offer. But I also wanted to say something about what those lessons look like and how they generalize across the broader study. Because one of the things that was an important finding was that even though schools were taking different steps and dealing with different problems and adopting different and distinctive designs, they were surprisingly consistent in what they thought they were moving toward, what they thought a truly blended school would look like, and what they wanted to become. And as we talked to people across the schools, in both the case study deep dive schools and in the shorter visits with more schools, we identified 8 elements that the teachers and the school administrators shared as things they saw as key components or elements of truly blended schools.
So I'm going to stop you for a second, Leslie, because we're supposed to have great slides that go along with the next piece, which we seem not to be able to get working. So I just want to, again, tell everybody, we will send you the slides. I hope you're able to listen and focus on what we're saying, and then people can still ask questions. But we will send out the slides, that especially of the pieces that are coming next, because these are really about tools and metrics that you will be able to hopefully use in thinking about blended learning in your school. Okay,
right.
so now, as opposed to, thank you all for submitting comments to telling us that we were having technical difficulties. And now, as you're listening, I hope, and if you've read, hopefully, the case studies before, now is a good time to transfer from telling us that we were having problems to thinking about questions that we can answer, because we're coming to the last part of the formal presentation, and then we can be ready to talk about questions that you might have, either about the 2 case studies, or perhaps if you have some questions about your own work or things that you are thinking about. So Leslie's going to lead us through the last piece, which is definitely going to be harder without visuals, but then the visuals will come after.
And it's going to be substantially harder without visuals. I hope everybody is very good at auditory learning. So I'm just going to read you the list of what these elements are. And again, these are drawn from what people in more than 30 day schools across the country told us were the characteristics of blended learning that they aspired toward. Not necessarily that they had them all in place, but they were moving toward them. First is increased content opportunities. Being able to offer content that a school could not, with its own staff, provide, whether it was AP courses or remedial work or labs or just resources about something for students in an elementary school. Increasing content opportunities. Second was a variety of instructional mode and media, that learning and teaching occur through different mechanisms as is appropriate for the lesson. Third is diagnostic assessment and data use. We gather data from the programs or from our own assessments, and we use that to make decisions about the pathways that students should be moving on or the pace at which they should be going. Fourth is differentiated instruction. Not all students need the same thing or need the same thing at the same time. In a truly blended classroom, you would be able to pay attention to the different needs of different students and design learning opportunities that met their needs. Sixth is the production and publication of student work. This one turns out to be a fairly important driver for many of the others. The idea that instead of just creating homework or an assignment that gets turned into the teacher, students share their work with other students, with a wider audience, sometimes even with a real-life audience, a government agency, or producing a video for YouTube that can go out to a wider public. Seventh is a shift in the role from teacher as deliverer of content to designer and facilitator of learning. That's something that a lot of people are familiar with as a goal, and they think that in a truly blended situation, that will be easier to do with the new tools. And here I just want to stress as an aside, that shift of the teacher role is actually a really difficult one to accomplish. And one of the surprising things that we learned across the schools is this is not a generational thing. It's not easier for new young teachers than it is for some of the, like you saw in the Marav case, digital dinosaurs. Younger teachers may be more familiar with the technology, but they're not necessarily familiar with how to teach in new ways using the new tools. So everybody struggles with this one. And the last element they said was important is school-wide planning and support. In some cases, that comes early, as it does with a new school that comes up with a design. In other cases, it shifts later as blended learning spreads across the school. And that leads me to my last point about these elements. These were common elements across the school. Everyone wants all of them, but everybody is not moving through some prescribed order. In the new schools, school planning comes first. In the established schools, it might come later. Data use seems to happen earlier in elementary schools, where the programs are better suited to provide usable data than they are in an online social studies platform. So the order doesn't seem to matter, or at least it isn't predictable or prescribable. It's, again, a matter of it depends on what your school needs, what your school has, and what your school chooses to start with. So those are our elements. I can kind of hold them up to the screen.
Yes, and everyone should have received an email with them already. So you can also follow along if you can open your email at the same time. So
I'm just going to give a minute here with this up to the screen and hope that people can see what these elements are.
Right.
And then I'll tell you, although I won't tell you in great detail, because without the slides, it isn't terribly helpful. But what we developed looking at the schools, looking at the data across all of these schools, was a rubric for what it looks like when a school moves in the area of increasing content opportunities from a traditional model where what we can provide is what the teacher can teach and it stays in the classroom, to technology enhanced to truly blended. I don't know if people can see that.
Right. One of the very wonderful things about the rubric that Leslie and her team have created is that it, as all rubrics do, it kind of allows you to actually see what elements go into the various goals and the various areas that that Leslie has outlined in the first slide, and you can kind of more easily get a feel for where your particular institutions might be on that scale.
Right. So I will tell you one last piece about this rubric use, because what we did with it was develop these implementation wheels, which look like this.
Perfect.
So that in each area, staff at a school can sit down and say, where are we in this area? Where are we filling in the blanks as we move toward truly blended, which would be a fully colored in circle? But schools are in really different places. So a school might look like this. It might be strong in some pieces, really not getting started in other pieces. And that's the point at which you begin to say, what's the interaction? Would it help to get teaching to change if we changed the way school planning and evaluation supports certain kinds of practices? So there are interactions among them. So I'm not going to walk through the rubric because it's just too hard to do without having the slides in front of you. But we have found these fairly useful in saying this is where we start in a stereotypical traditional school. This is where we would end up in a truly blended school. And where are we on this continuum? How far have we gotten toward where we say we want to be? And I think that voluntary piece is important. So the very last slide, which you also can't really see, since I've talked about what blended learning is and what's in common across these schools, is to just show you a postcard from 1910, an image of what education might look like in the 21st century, when students are plugged in to their headphones, all listening alone as wired-in information is being delivered into their brains. And across the schools, we did not see anything that looked like that or hear anything that sounded like that as an aspiration. There's wide agreement on what blended learning is not. It is not about plugging in students. It is not about replacing or displacing teachers. It is about finding the most productive mix of the teaching and the tools to let students learn what we think they need to learn to survive and be successful in the 21st century. And the 21st century that's in my image is not one of plugged-in people in a factory of school. So that's the end of the slides. That's kind of the end of the lesson, what we learned from the schools. So Rachel, I don't know if you have questions.
No, we have some questions already coming in. I think I just want to add one kind of the lens that that I bring to the work. Also, have been graciously hosted at many of the schools that are doing this work, and having learned quite a bit over the last 4 to 5 years about school change in any area, not just in the area of blended learning. About how many stakeholders really need to be involved if a change is to happen, and how the shared goals and vision and communication is a very important piece of that work. I would say even the schools that are kind of leading the way within day schools are still on a continuum trajectory of where they are going with this work, right? No one is yet at the place where they think they have the wheel fully filled in all the areas, right? And whether that's because you said, you know, the software is just not there yet, or whether it's because they are growing grade to grade and, you know, and their vision is not fully formed yet, or whether it is because there are teachers that still need further professional growth. All of them are still on this journey. But I think what's striking is what you said at the very beginning, is that no one seems to be stepping off the journey. Right. Everyone seems to feel that there is value in the model and in working towards that goal. So I think that's very exciting. We're going to continue to assist schools and additional schools in trying to get there, and continue to share what we're learning with with the field. So so that's great. Okay, great. So we have one or two questions. We can try to tackle those. Maybe the first one. So somebody asked, what were some specific examples of improved learning through blended learning in these case studies? So I think, Leslie, you can answer that, and maybe then I'll talk about learning overall.
Okay. So I can say something about one of the more dramatic examples, I think, that I saw of improved learning that I didn't believe was going to happen. A school that's working on a kind of expedition where they're looking at inclusion in the community and how do we incorporate practices and habits to assist people with different needs. And as they're working on this project, they encounter someone in a city office who is paraplegic and who types and works by having a helmet that points at the keyboard, but it's very hot and it's very heavy. And this class, a team in this class, decided that they were going to try to build a better hat for him, one based on a baseball cap instead of a helmet that didn't weigh as much and would still work, which seemed to me totally impossible for a high school class to design something that would actually be a real product with a real use and really useful. So they did a lot of work online to figure out what metal strengths and weights were. They did a lot of work to try to figure out what the electronics were. They brought in someone from a university who was a metals and design specialist, and they actually built a baseball cap that made this person extraordinarily grateful. They learned a lot through that experience. Most blended learning classes are not that ambitious in designing the production of student work that actually fills a need like that. But what they do is allow different students to pursue their interests and passions into areas that couldn't be done as a whole class activity. They allow people to speed up and slow down when they need to because they've got some period of self-paced work. And those are useful learning opportunities. They use online resources in science classes or in Hebrew to talk to people across the planet. So those are some kind of learning opportunities. Those are not the same as learning outcomes. The question of whether these opportunities translate into higher test scores is still an open question in many schools, although I think we're gathering evidence now that it's not a huge gain, but in general it is a gain when teachers shift to blended learning. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, I want to say something about improved learning. I think that, that's a very kind of open term, right? What does improved learning mean? I think we're, what you spoke about, Leslie, and what comes to mind, when I hear that is, are we looking only at data outcomes of, to show improved learning? Are we using proxies that we imagine, show improved learning, such as, engagement in a classroom, right? I can tell you from my site visits to these schools, there is a much higher degree of student engagement in classrooms that are, either rotational models or individualized flex plans. Students are working in smaller groups. Students are working more one-on-one. They are more engaged, right? Is more engagement 100% going to lead to a higher test score? I think we don't know that 100% yet, as you've said. By the way, particularly in day schools, the schools are doing this for a very short period of time, so it's kind of hard to really have strong data yet. We're hoping to be able to share with the field, I would hope in about 6 months' time, some data from the Mohl day schools that might take a look at that. Schools that have done it for 3 years, and then over that time we'll have something to say. I think also, it's one more thing about this, is improved learning in a 21st century world might be judged differently, right? Are we meeting the 4 C's, right? Is there more collaboration? Is there more connectivity? Is there and I think one of the reasons that many schools are looking at blended and thinking about what roles technology can fill in the classroom is then thinking about what does this open up, right? If my drill and practice is handled by the computer, or my direct instruction is handled some of the time by technology, what does that then allow my teacher to do that they couldn't have done before? And hopefully those are things that improve learning in 21st century classrooms. I will say one more thing. There are beginning to be study results in the general ed field that do point to some data. Just one in particular comes to mind. Just this past month in November, the RAND Corporation, which funded by the Gates Foundation, published a study of schools that they've been looking at over 3 years, 62 schools and about 1,100 students. And they did find that the majority of schools had positive effects on math and reading performance over 2 years. Again, populations are different. It seems that sometimes lower students who were in the lower range of scoring are making even more gains than students who were higher ranking before this. And so obviously there's more to learn, and there's quite, both from the general ed world and in our schools as well. And we're going to continue to look at that as we move forward. Okay, next question. How do schools fund a blended learning program that will help them increase course offerings? By increasing offerings, won't we need to increase staff? So maybe I'll start with that. So I think, again, we have to kind of differentiate between online learning and blended learning, and also the notion of different age grades, right? So in a high school, a middle school, or a high school setting, a school might look to purely online learning to provide courses that they are not able to provide. And then they do not need necessarily a teacher in their school. The teacher comes from the online school course that you are using. What we have found is that that is usually a less expensive endeavor than hiring an additional staff person. One of the reasons we are looking at this in Judaic studies is for exactly that reason. Whether you choose a teacher from the Lookstein program who teaches your students along with students of another school, perhaps, or you join a consortium where you provide a teacher to teach students in other schools, and thereby you gain access to courses from other day schools that are being developed by teachers in like schools. The financial models are, for the most part, less expensive than having to hire a faculty person to teach what would likely be a small section in your own school if it's a course that you're not offering. So that's how schools are tending to look at this. In terms of blended, for the most part, people are using, and some, by the way, I should say, even with online courses, there does often need to be a facilitator on site to make sure that the student is doing the course, fulfilling the obligations, moving through the work. There needs to be someone who's kind of checking in on them, but not someone who's necessarily trained in that subject matter to deliver the course itself. Blended is not being used as much to increase course offerings. At this point, it's really being used more to create, as we spoke about, data-driven personalized learning within larger classrooms, because it's then a mix of your teacher who's already in the room and technology-driven instruction as well. Leslie, you want to add anything?
Yeah, and it's hard without the slides in front, but the characteristic that was identified was increased content offerings rather than necessarily increased course offerings, because that included more of the elementary interests as well as the high schools. But we did see, for example, we saw a high school where a student wanted to take an advanced foreign language course that the school did not have a teacher for. So that student took a fully online course in that subject. In another, we had a small group of students who wanted to do AP Physics, while the rest of the group who would have been in physics wanted to do honors physics. One teacher taught both classes in the same space, while the AP students did extra work through an online program, but with a teacher who could support those. In another school, a different school, we saw, with tiny class sizes, we saw earth science, biology, and physics being taught in the same room at the same time by one science teacher. The school could not afford to hire 3, but all of those content areas needed to be covered. We've also seen in some schools where taking an online course, if it's understood as to some degree an elective, like the advanced foreign language, the cost was passed on to the family, because those courses are being offered by the state virtual high school. They're not terribly expensive, so the school didn't have to staff it.
Great. Okay. I think probably our last question for today is a question about grading and how I guess it's a question about how grading is impacted by this model. So, Leslie, you answer.
Again, that's going to be an it depends answer. In schools that are offering a straight online course for students that they're not offering, the grading is often being done by the online provider, and the school just reviews it to make sure that it's reasonable and reasonably accurate. In other cases, the school has its own standards and they want to do more active supervision because it's a course they do offer, and so they kind of blend the data from the online provider with their own assessments and observations, so it just becomes one more piece of the grade that's assigned. In the elementary schools, like in the case of Zafon, where they're using iReady, grading isn't something that happens at the end of the year. That grade is given by teachers who write anecdotal reports, but assessments happen on an almost daily basis, at least weekly, so students can see how they're doing and keep track and monitor their own progress, and teachers see where their strengths and weaknesses are and can intervene on a regular basis. So there's a lot of formative assessment going on, which is a little bit different from grading.
Right, and I would just add kind of parent access to that is something that schools are also kind of navigating, right? How much can parents see of the software itself? How are schools learning to report to parents on the data that they are receiving, right? Both throughout and how, you know, even at a parent-teacher conference, what does it mean to show a parent not just, you know, a grade or a Lexile score even, but really a breakdown of particular skills, especially in younger grades, and you know, growth as opposed to just a grade at the end.
Right. And teachers in the elementary school talk about that as being extraordinarily helpful, that instead of saying, I think your child is having trouble reading, they can look at the spreadsheet and say, these are the skills your child is doing well with, these are the areas where there's difficulty.
Great. Okay, so we've reached the 2 o'clock hour. I'm just going to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm going to apologize for our little bit of technical difficulties. You should all have received the slide deck by now. If you have questions about those slides in relation to what you heard, or just follow-up questions, In general, either for myself or for Professor Siskin, feel free to email us. We're happy to help you further this work in your schools, and we look forward to learning together in the future. So thank you, Leslie. Thank you, everyone, and we'll say good afternoon for today.
Thank you, and thank you all for participating.
Bye-bye.